Hello, my name is Shane Brodie. I've been traveling around the country talking to trans, intersex, gender nonconforming, non-binary people, and also allies, parents, some minors. And right now I'm in a central state, and I have a guest, and he's going to introduce himself in the way that he feels comfortable.
Hi, my name is Leo Evans. Everybody calls me Lee. I'm a trans guy. I am here in the hot and dusty state of Nebraska. I work as a scientific researcher. I study how children learn language and how they process sound in the brain. And I've been transitioning now for just under 3 years. I am 50 years old.
Oh, okay. So we're peers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's about all.
Okay. So it sounds like you have quite an intense career there. Let's see. What is that like? I guess just really diving into it. What is that like transitioning as an older person and having all these responsibilities? Because I was in academia for about a half second, and I know that it's really a full-time job, like 24 hours forever.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it was intimidating to try to start the transition, and I fully took advantage of COVID to do it.
A lot of trans people did that, actually.
Because I was teaching at the time, and I wasn't excited about the prospect of physically going through a lot of awkwardness in front of a bunch of people very publicly.
Right.
And
right, because when you're a researcher, you're connected to kind of cohorts of people who you are supervising and also are supervising you.
Yes. And I was still working on my PhD, so I was still getting it at that time. So I was finishing up and I was teaching.
Yes. Getting all those signatures.
Yes. And I just didn't want to go through a very awkward period very publicly that
and it is like an adolescence.
It is. And I didn't want to have to deal. I now I don't care because I'm so happy, and if I had to do it over again, I would definitely say do it earlier. But I was nervous.
That's my next question.
Yeah, I was nervous. I didn't want to be doing something awkward. I was already going back to school to get my PhD, and I was older than everybody else, and then I was going to add this other.
That's always fun, though, right? When you're so much older, like almost twice their age.
Oh, and then you get to go through a second adolescence, a second puberty in front of. I was like, I just don't know about this. But when COVID started, I took advantage of that to have some time, and I was like, well, I'll have at least a year to not have to see people on a daily basis, and I'm going to take full advantage.
Were you teaching at that time? Or?
Yes, I was teaching online, but so there's awkwardness in that.
Yes.
It was still strange, and my voice probably did very interesting things during the course of that first semester when I was on T, but it wasn't the same. I didn't feel as awkward.
I mean, this is kind of a strange question, but did any students kind of ask you about it?
No. So when I was online, they weren't that interested. They were going through their own things as well. So we started teaching back in person right before I moved to Nebraska.
Where were you before, by the way?
Connecticut.
Okay. Oh, so different. Yes. Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, a very blue state, a very mild weather state.
Yes.
So there's a lot of changes.
What I think of Connecticut, and maybe I'm wrong, there's also like a lot of wealth there, and I'm not sure about this area. It seems like maybe there's it's lower income.
Definitely, there's a disparity between the amount of wealth in Connecticut and the amount of wealth here on average. Mine has probably increased now that I have a full-time job and I'm not a PhD student.
Sure.
So my own relative has improved, but I think that the wealth in Connecticut can be in pockets as well.
Okay.
And overall, it's a very wealthy state, but if you get out into more rural areas, it's just people with the same amount of money as anywhere else paying taxes like they are stockbrokers.
Yeah.
So before I transitioned, I was a woman. Heterosexual woman. So I didn't really think about identity. I mean, I fell into that sort of cis hetero world where you don't think about identifying.
So you weren't even connected like with queer community or anything?
No. I would have said I was bisexual. I had dated one. So predominantly all my dating had been with men. I had dated one woman, so I would have said I was bisexual, but I didn't really, there is no real way to connect with a bisexual community, and I didn't really feel bisexual. It felt more, there was just this one, I did date one woman, but that was her, not necessarily anything larger than
That's
that.
interesting that you say that it's difficult to connect with the bi community. Why? What was your experience with that?
None. I just, because I didn't feel, I thought for a while when I first started dating her, I was like, oh, well, maybe, because there had been underlying things going on my whole life with things that I didn't understand, I couldn't name. And I thought, oh, well, maybe this is it. Maybe I'm just gay, maybe I'm, and then it just didn't make any sense to me because I wasn't attracted to women.
Okay.
And
so just one particular
person.
Okay.
And it took me a long time to unpack it because I think it wasn't so much that she was a woman, but that she didn't expect me to be one. And that was the freedom within that for me. And it took a while to understand that. But she was the only person,
So did she think of you as a fellow then?
I don't think so, but she dated only men, and I had only dated men, and it just sort of happened. But I wasn't, and she wasn't particularly, like, I wasn't overly masculine. I was fairly neutral. She was fairly neutral, and it just clicked for whatever reason.
That's interesting that you found each other.
Yeah,
because you seem to be coming from really different places.
Oh yeah. So it just was something that clicked, and we were friends for a long time. So we were friends for a couple of years, and then it just happened, and one of those things. But it didn't feel right. And I had my best friend from high school was lesbian, and she was like, "You're not a lesbian," and I'm like, "I know, I'm not. I don't know, but there's just this one thing." But I don't want to diminish it because it happened, and I don't have any bad feelings about that in and of itself. But I never felt that was, I thought that was going to answer a lot of the questions I had, but it didn't. And so it didn't sink in to as an identity, because I couldn't claim that as an identity, because
it wasn't something you were going to pursue afterwards.
No, and I went right back in the
community wise or something.
And I never felt comfortable within the limited amount of time I spent in spaces. It was very uncomfortable because I just didn't share a whole lot, mainly because I was attracted to men, so that's the biggest problem that I had. But it never sunk in.
That's the biggest problem you had.
Yeah, that was the biggest problem I had with but and it was more confusing, but I thought it was going to answer a lot of questions, and it didn't. And so I went through, and I did, I was dating a woman, and I did go through a lot of the internal work, and I unpacked a lot of things and saw our culture, because I was living in the States at the time, from a new perspective, from a queer perspective. I did that because we were together for like 3 years.
Right. And you were, even if that wasn't an internal identity, you were visibly queer.
Yes. And so, yes, and I...
Was this on the East Coast? Connecticut?
No, this was in Kentucky.
Oh, okay. Kentucky.
Yes. That's where I grew up. And it was an interesting experience, and I'm glad I had it. I did a lot of things, but it never felt like I was part of the queer community at that point.
So after all that work, sort of internal work where you were thinking about queer issues and that sort of thing, I guess, well, what specific issues were you thinking about?
I think
Like oppression or...
I think I was realizing because we dated for like 3 years and it was like, well,
That's a while.
and you start to realize the economic consequences of not being able, because marriage wasn't legal then, and so there were a lot of social things that were closed down, a lot of and so I realized, just how much of our structure was built on this heteronormative model, which I hadn't paid attention to because I'd always been in heterosexual relationships, and you don't really, you don't have the perspective to see the bias when you're in them. And so I saw just how housing structures, how like the whole economy is geared for heterosexual people, because I was trying to figure out my future. I thought, how are we going to fit into this? And it wasn't easy.
Sharing economic resources like bank accounts and, living together. Sometimes even that is an issue, even though it's so common for people to have roommates and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's an issue.
Yeah. And so I just realized a lot of things, but they seemed more like, and there were very real social problems, but it didn't feel like an identity problem. It felt like a problem, but not an identity issue. So I don't know.
So did that experience sort of feed into your realization about being trans at all?
Sort of through a roundabout way.
Kind of like a big arc.
Yes. Because one of the things that, like I said, it wasn't a typical relationship. So a lot of our more intimate experiences were very one-sided. So I wasn't usually undressed or, and it was a very, and then I found the term like stone and I thought, okay, that makes sense to me. That makes a lot of sense to me. That's how I feel, but I didn't feel that way necessarily. But I also
just in that relationship,
but I'd always had trouble in other relationships as well for different reasons. But what I liked about that relationship is she was okay with that. So she was comfortable with it, and I didn't have to deal with my body in a sexual way, if that makes sense. And so that's what I think I liked.
So you just focused on her. Okay.
And it was fine. But I didn't have to deal with my body, which is where a lot of my issues were lying. And then I realized that I needed to take a look at why I couldn't deal with my body, what was so wrong.
Was that through therapy? Were you talking to people about that?
No, I went into like a moratorium. So after I broke up with her, I dated like 2 or 3 men after that, I guess. And 2. One that I really, really, really cared about and was very serious about and really cared about, but it couldn't work. And at that point, I was just like, I'm done. There's something so wrong with me.
Oh, no.
There's just something so wrong with me that, relationships just don't seem to be the thing. So I'm just like, I am tired of this. And I went into this like moratorium phase where I was like, I'm going to focus on work. I'm going to do my job and just whatever that is.
And it's so easy to do if you're kind of on this track of wanting to be an academic.
It was easy to focus and completely put that aside and be like, it's not for me. It's never going to work. That wasn't in the cards. I've tried this. I've tried that. I've tried this. Nothing is, working. And just don't think about it. And I did that for about 6-7 years. And then when I moved to Connecticut, that's where the trans things started bubbling up, because that was the first time I was in an environment where people were like, the first day, what are your pronouns?
Oh, okay.
And I'd never heard that question before.
So were you going from Kentucky to Connecticut?
So I'd been in Hungary. I'd been living in Hungary for 12 years in a rural village there, so all of the transgender tipping point and all of the things that were happening in the United States, I was oblivious to.
Yes.
I missed that. I was under
I gotta say, I connect with that a lot because I've sometimes, well, not often, but sometimes I've lived in places that are a little bit more isolated, like not having good internet and, that sort of thing. Or sometimes I just take a really long break from pop culture and I don't check in and it just doesn't interest me. So when I come back, I'm like, oh, there are trans people out here who say anti-trans things. I'm like shocked by that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm just like, oh, this is how the world is now.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that burst through my bubble was when like Caitlyn Jenner was on the cover of Vanity Fair, but
right, that was so big.
That was huge.
Yeah.
That made, and I knew that happened, but that was hardly anything that was going to emotionally connect with me. Like I
and also
didn't
for people
feel
like
it.
us who are going from like female to male. That's old terms. Sorry if somebody's offended by that, but doing that sort of transition. Caitlyn Jenner really isn't a model for that.
No. I would, and I didn't feel, I could see that, but it didn't stir anything up, any ideas. I was just like, that's fine. Like I didn't have, and I was always interested. I've always had sort of the typical, I think, trans fascination with drag and gender blending and things like that. So I was like, that's really cool that she did that.
And it's been around a while, like in music and whatnot. Yeah.
So I thought it was cool that she did that. Yeah. Then she turned out to be, but I didn't have a problem with
that. That's a mild response to it. But.
that was cool, but it didn't stir anything up. But then when I got to Connecticut, so that would have been like 2016. It was right before Trump got elected. Was the first time, and I'd been in Kentucky for 2 years, but there's nothing going on in Kentucky, gender-wise. Yeah. And people were like, "What are your pronouns?" Like we would go around in every meeting, and I was just like,
part of the culture there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was just, what do you mean? I was just literally had no idea what was going on, and it got explained to me in a way that I don't necessarily agree now with the explanations.
What
but
was it then?
Well, it was like
things change,
Right. Well, and it was cis people. They were like, okay, so some people choose, they don't like what they're assigned at birth, and they can choose, but and so everybody has a choice in what gender they are, and I don't necessarily think that that's language I would agree with. But
so you have an issue with the word choice?
Yeah, I do now.
Okay, yeah,
I do now because I think that's not the best way to talk about it.
Yes. They used to talk about that with gay people as well.
Right.
Like that it was a lifestyle choice.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a choice. I do think that, well, as an aside, I do think you choose how to express yourself, and you can choose what steps to take, and you can choose to be public, but the internal feelings, there's no choice there. But that was how it was explained to me. And they're like, what are your pronouns? And then I was like, I don't know. And they're like, see, you're a woman and you choose that. You're happy with that. And I just remember these alarm bells going off in my head. Wait, I didn't choose that. I'm not happy with that. Wait, I can. And it was just.
That's interesting that you had an epiphany in kind of like a boring meeting setting.
with a 20-something cis person explaining to me, the old person, like I was ridiculous about what pronouns are.
That's funny.
I'm like, you're a woman because you were identified that way. You're happy with that. You choose that. And I'm like, oh. And so I immediately just went home and just started Googling.
Were you just really uncomfortable or something? I mean,
it was just that moment of, wait, what? There's not everybody has. I don't have to, like, there's a
like, this is a thing that
right.
It
was like a dark room, and suddenly a little candle got lit in the corner, and I'm like, there's potentially something to follow up on here, because I don't feel comfortable. I wouldn't choose this if I have any choice whatsoever. This isn't what I would choose. And so I went, and then I started just Googling, and then I Googled intensely.
Were there any pages that you remember that popped up that made an impression on you?
I don't remember the early stuff where I was just sort of Googling for information. I do know that when I got...
Like organizations or, like PFLAG or GLAAD or anything like that?
I remember seeing P flag things, I remember the Human Rights Campaign.
Oh yeah.
Seeing their work, and then I just started Googling on YouTube mostly, and I think that YouTube was more helpful than organizations, because I think to get to the organizations you have to have a question, and I was just more like,
and they're dealing with bigger issues too,
where I was
less
like
personal. Yeah.
How do you know if you're transgender? And then so like
type that in
exactly, and so I think
what's the menu? What's the recipe?
I was
for
like,
that?
is this a thing? Is it possible?
Sure.
And I think that the biggest influences for me, well, this is bad, but like one of the first things that pops up if you Google that is going to be people like Blair White, and so I watched that.
So
and went,
people who are actually anti-trans.
and yes,
Yeah. Even though they're trans people, their whole thing, their whole way that they are famous and make money and whatever is from being anti-trans. Yeah.
And so I remember watching that, and that didn't help because I was and you kind of, I think, unfortunately, when you're questioning that, their dogmatism can be dangerous because it can seem like a very, this is what you should do and this is the real,
right?
And
you're
so looking for that,
you're looking for information like that. Yeah.
And
like,
so
how do I do
this?
Yeah.
And so I remember that, and that was, but it didn't sit well with me.
I always wonder why people are attracted to what, like trans people sometimes are attracted to what they say. So that kind of makes sense. So they're very clear, like, oh, if you want to be a transsexual in a particular way, then this is what you would do. Yeah.
Right. And I felt like I wasn't sure. And you feel, at least for me, my generation, I felt like I'm doing something very taboo, very strange, very not what I'm supposed to be doing. Am I, you have all this worry about it. And then they're like, no, these, I was going to say freak. But then people like Blair White or Calvin Guerra was big at that time too, and I just saw some of their videos, and they're like, "No, you're normal. These people are the freaks," and
other trans people
that don't do it the right way.
Okay,
and
so they split off, like, here's the good ones and here's the bad ones. Here's the bad ones. Okay,
and that lasted for me about a month, and I was like, "This is just not me at all. Like, I don't see the world this way," and I definitely.
And they always, like, they say some things that are truthful, or that kind of make sense, and then they couch it in all this bad political stuff. And it's a bad combination.
So I think that was the first, and then I started watching ContraPoints, Cat Black, and people that were much more balanced and nuanced and reflective.
There's also a lot of
about trans things.
There's also like a lot of like personal like videos, like, here's me, I'm going out to whatever for the first time. Or here's me dressing up. And
there was a one, I think the name was Finn, who was an older trans man who was documenting his transition. I tried to look for people who were older because teenagers, it didn't resonate as much. Sure. And so it kind of went this fury of looking for information, and then Trump got elected. And then it was like, ooh. And then everything just sort of got squished down for about a year.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think it was normal too. I've heard other people do that. Like, you come to this realization and then you're like, no, I can't do this. Like, so I can't do this.
You were afraid of the political climate.
I was afraid of the change. I was afraid of looking that deeply at myself. And then in that political climate, it seemed like an easy excuse to not do that hard work.
Okay.
And so I just sort of went on hold for about a year, and then it just, every time we had to do pronouns, it was just this uncomfortableness about it.
Yeah.
And I was like, I had to dig deeper, and I started thinking about things, and then I started looking for more targeted information about what can you do, what steps. And
sometimes I worry about those pronouns, and this might be a slightly controversial, but about those pronoun discussions, because if you're not somebody who's out yet,
they were disturbing.
Then you're outing yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
I felt that they were very traumatizing for me because I didn't know what to say, and no matter what I said at that point, I didn't feel comfortable with it.
Because you're either outing yourself or you're misgendering yourself. Yeah.
And so I felt very uncomfortable with them, and I understand the importance of them.
Yeah, and it was important to you.
It was helpful, but I was also an adult, and I'm thankful I was, but it was very upsetting in a way, because I didn't know what to say, and I wasn't sure, and I was like, well, what's the route forward? And then I kept saying she, her, because I felt I had to, but it became more and more uncomfortable. And
did you ever use other pronouns like they, them?
No. And if you ask me today, I would say I'm probably non-binary rather than binary trans, but I don't, again, feel that the way that identity gets played out fits me very well.
So I'm getting what the next question is. How do you think of it gets played out in our culture?
I think non-binary gets played out in a more questioning role and a more theatrical role sometimes. And I have a very, for better or for worse, however I feel internally, my presentation is very binary or aiming towards that. But that's just my personality more than anything else. But I don't necessarily feel that they, them pronouns would be comfortable for me, and I don't necessarily feel that I'm a man. And I think that was another reason that took me so long to get there, was I don't have a strong gender feeling, and I think the best term is agender or something like that. That would fit me better.
Sure. Well, lots of people go by agender, actually.
Yeah. I don't feel, and I didn't feel, and when I started reading the stories and I started reading books about trans men and autobiographies and anthologies about trans men, and it was a very different story than I had, and so I didn't resonate with it.
I think some of those stories are a little bit practiced too, because we kind of had to do that a long time ago in order to even get healthcare.
Right.
So I look at some of those stories with a little bit of skepticism sometimes, and I'm sorry if that hurts anybody's feelings, but.
And I don't know, because I didn't go through it at that time, so I don't have that perspective, and I just have to accept what people are saying at face value. But it didn't resonate because I never felt as a small, like I look back now at my childhood, and I think I would have said and I always felt I was a girl, but I was supposed to be a boy, but I wasn't a boy. And I'd never really liked the stereotypically boy things. And so as a girl,
you were maybe a different kind of boy.
Yeah, I was, and I was more comfortable. I felt where I was raised, I had more wiggle room as a girl, and I wasn't super girly. I wasn't, but I was just sort of neutral. Like I was just sort of, I liked this and I liked that, and I liked this and I didn't like that or that. But I didn't have a strong hatred of dresses. I didn't have a strong love of football or fishing or cars. I didn't have any super strong commitments. I liked dancing and art and painting and sort of like gender neutral creative things. And I liked math and science, and I liked poetry, but I didn't really have a strong gender identity, but I always had a feeling that my body was uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable from about the age of 5, I would say.
Well, I think with kind of, this opening up and, projects like this and similar that are out there, that and people's biographies and people taking on different words to describe their identity, whether that's agender or neutrois or non-binary, there's demigender, there's all kinds of different words people are using now. It really opens up a way for people to sort of challenge kind of this narrative of what it means to be trans in various ways.
Yeah.
Because what people try to do, at least trans medicalists and, whatnot, is they really try to narrow it.
Right.
Right. This is the only kind of people who are trans, and they are just like me, and they have to go through all these steps and all this torture in order to be trans, because that's what I did. And I love it that particularly younger people, but some older people, are kind of opening that up. And part of that has to do with informed consent was
Right.
really important.
Oh yeah. I agree. And I feel like I don't have, and that was part of the thing I didn't like about the more conservative trans people I was seeing on YouTube, was it was at a certain point the rigidity was nice, but then I was like, but you're gonna box me in, and as soon as I step out of your line, like, because I wasn't a teenager, and I think that younger people with less life experience might be more impressionable,
less skeptical
and
about
it's
the
like,
rigidity.
if you're rigid about this, I know exactly the second I step out of line you're gonna come from me
exactly
too. And I didn't like that, because I was like, I'm already going against the grain a lot, and I need the freedom to be me, not to step into another box.
And that's what they do, actually. They look for people who are, outside of it, and they make fun of them.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to get on you, but you mentioned that being non-binary, maybe there's a theatrical element. I think
I don't think so, but I think in the culture that's how it's seen.
Exactly.
I don't think those people are, or I don't think non-binary people are, but I think in the culture it's seen that way.
Yes, and I'm not trying to get on you.
Yeah.
But using that word, I think that reflects how some people are portrayed.
Right.
As being silly or over the top. Whereas actually it's their genuine identity.
Oh, I completely agree. And I didn't, hopefully I didn't say it like, I think, because you asked how are they portrayed in the culture, and I said as being more theatrical. I don't think that, but I don't feel like,
no, I'm glad that you said that, because it's true.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And for me, I feel like I would be non-binary, but I don't want to. I'm comfortable, and honestly, I don't really think about my gender identity that much.
Well, you don't have to take on that word. You can use whatever you want.
I don't honestly think about it that much. I think that all the heavy lifting was done before I made the decision, and now I'm just rolling with it, and I'm just me, and I'm so much happier. And I think, it's still early, and I started transitioning when I was 47, I guess. Yeah. So the changes are a little bit slower, but I every day things get a little bit better, and I pass a little bit more, and that for me is important for me personally. But I also, at the same time, the longer life goes on, the less I care about it at the same time. Sure. So I'm
you're kind of on your way too.
Yeah. And I don't
worry about it.
Yeah, I don't have that angst that I had in the beginning, but I just want the freedom to do my job and not worry about it. And I feel super angry almost that currently our political climate makes me think about it, because that's what they're saying is like, people make trans their whole identity and blah 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 blah, and it's like, yeah, because we have to, we're forced to do that, and I don't want to. I just want to go to work and do my job and not come home and see where can I go to the bathroom.
And once again, they're pointing to people who are very out loud about being trans because they're doing activism or advocacy or something, whatever word you want to use. It's all the same, and so those people are like talking about trans issues all the time because they're working on them.
That's their job. And I have a tremendous respect for that. And I don't have a job where
But that's not everybody.
Right. And
you're doing other important work.
Right. Yeah. And I do as much as I can, but I just don't have the luxury of I have a job that's 24 hours a day, basically.
Yes.
So I don't have as much free time for things other than I write letters.
Several jobs at once.
Yes.
Like you're teaching, you're doing research, you're writing your own papers.
Grant proposals, data, etc.
Yeah.
So other than writing letters to state senators and representatives, I don't really do that much of, but it's definitely what you read, I would say, in the general press nowadays is mostly just the lowest rung of journalism. Yeah. I mean, it's not on trans issues. They're not researching things at all. No. And it's frustrating because they'll take the opinion of someone that's negative, like has a negative opinion, and not research it.
And their whole life is being anti-trans. I mean, some of these activists are just like, that's their whole deal. That's their whole life doing that.
Yeah, and they're just taken as not having an agenda.
Yes. Right.
That speaking facts, and that if anybody counters them, they only are doing that because they're biased and they have an agenda. And it's so frustrating.
The problem with those too is once they're published, they're oftentimes used as some sort of evidence.
Oh yeah, because they'll quote each other.
Yes, by other writers, but then also by politicians.
Oh yeah,
by legislators who are making laws and that sort of thing. That sort of thing has happened recently. It's really, really awful. So we were talking a little bit, and I was thinking about your being somebody who transitioned later in life. I started physically transitioning when I was 29. And that's very different than being in your late 40s, I would think. And I was wondering if you could go into some detail about that, because I'm going to assume, and we talked about this just a very tiny bit, that you were probably at least perimenopausal. Right, which means reduction of hormones and that sort of thing. And then you're going on testosterone. So that's a big shift. Yeah.
It was a big shift. So I actually, when I started the testosterone, my periods came back stronger for a while.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I didn't have a cessation completely for about 8 months, and
were you on what people call low dose?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I was so when I started, I was very small physically, and so I am not a very big person, and I generally, when I take any sort of medication, whether that be for just like a Tylenol or something, it's very impactful for me. Yeah. I just have always been sensitive to any sort of thing. And so testosterone is pretty powerful. And I was like, well, I don't want to get into a situation where where I have with other medicine, where I'm taking the dose of a full person who's got 40 more pounds of body than I do, and it's too strong.
So you talked with your provider,
right,
and you talked about starting slowly.
And I started, I started at 0.2, can we talk about it? So I started at 0.25 milliliter or milligrams of a 200 milligram suspension.
Was
so whatever,
0.25.
Cypionate.
Okay.
And so 0.25 milliliters of a 200 milligram suspension. And so that's the lowest. Like, it's not micro dosing, but it's low.
Is that every couple weeks?
I did it every week.
Okay, every week.
So I started with that because I told myself I don't want to get into a situation where my body just feels uncomfortable. And so I did that. I talked to my endocrinologist, and that was the plan for 3 months, and then we would reevaluate. So I went back at the end of 3 months. I was like, we need more. we're fine. But
and at the same time, you're working really hard. You know, you're getting your PhD, and you're moving on to working at different positions, and you're actually moving. It sounds like you're moving across the country and that sort of thing. So it makes sense that you would want to kind of ease into this.
It.
Yeah.
Right. And I also, I knew I wanted this, so I didn't have any questions about, and I wasn't confused about what I wanted, but I was nervous about the physical, not what the testosterone was going to do, but just what it was going to feel like physically to go through those things. And I was like, I don't know if it's wise to just go too quickly. And so I told myself before I started, I was like, we're going to start slow, and you're going to get 3 months. And you're gonna just pay attention to everything.
So it was like a trial for you, a test.
Right.
Okay, a test run.
Because I didn't know. I mean, I knew I needed to try. I knew I needed to do this, but I also didn't want to go into it without an escape plan just in case, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Because I didn't want to get into a situation where I was unhappy about something and I felt I had to stay with it, or if it felt wrong, or I've heard other people, they just don't feel right on testosterone. I was like,
also, some people just stop because they get a little bit of change and that's all they wanted.
Right. And I wasn't sure. And I could say to myself, yes, I want these changes. Yes, I want to do this. But until you actually experience it, you don't know.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I'm just going to...
My dog is, I don't know what he's doing.
I'm going to go slow.
Yeah.
And I think that was the right decision.
And everybody's process is really different. Like, some people are just ready and they want, full dose, and, they want surgery very quickly because they've been thinking about it for most of their lives.
Well, I had surgery really quick. I had surgery within 6 months.
Okay,
so
great.
I did do surgery.
Great.
Like, I knew I wanted
Great.
it. I knew I wanted to do it. I just wasn't sure what it was actually going to feel like, and I'd had bad reactions to medications in the past, so
and it is quite a shift.
Oh yeah.
And it can be an emotional shift. It has to do with like your energy as well. You're actually growing a little bit. I don't know if you became more muscular, but some people become more muscular.
Slightly.
They put on some weight.
That I did not do, but I loved it. So I, from the first...
What did you love, by the way, specifically?
I felt a sense of calm and a lot of just... Because I remember I had to drive across the state to go to the endocrinologist to do the first shot, so they had to do it in.
Oh, really?
Right. So I did everything telehealth because it was COVID, but for the first injection, you physically had to go there, and they showed you how to do the first injection.
That's interesting because this is a larger metropolitan area, I would think. Why would you have to go across the state to do that?
That's where my endocrinologist... Well, Connecticut's a small state, so it's...
I thought you were doing that here. Okay.
No. This isn't Connecticut. It's a small state.
Right. 40 minutes and you're across the state.
Yeah. But I remember driving there, and I had to get up early in the morning and drive there, and I was like, okay, and then you get your shot, and you don't feel anything. And then you're like, oh, okay, so you drive.
It takes a while.
And then you drive home, and I'm like, okay. And then about 2 days later, you're like, oh, I definitely did that 2 days ago. And then everything just sort of felt very natural. It just started feeling much more natural, right? I would say from the second week of feeling just a sense of connectedness and a weight lifted off my shoulder, and everything just started making more sense biologically, mentally. I'm probably romanticizing it a bit. It probably wasn't, but it was a sense of calmness, and I think there was just a connectedness, and I never felt.
Did you feel like just more present in your body? Like
I definitely felt more present in my body, but I also felt. So emotionally, I've heard other people say that they feel like their emotions get turned off, and I don't think that's how I would experience it. I don't feel like my emotions, I'm just as emotional as I was before, but I can actually experience emotions and not this wave of undifferentiated emotion. So now I can say I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. It's given me mentally a space that sort of makes sense. And I've had a lot of positive physical changes. So I'd suffered from migraines since I was 18 years old, and since I've been on testosterone, I've gone from like 3 migraines a month to like 3 a year.
Yeah.
So I've had that reduction.
3 a month to 3 a year? My goodness. Wow. I
had a lot of skin problems, itchiness and eczema that cleared up once I got on testosterone.
I know it made my skin like greasier or more moist.
Yeah. I sweat a lot more.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And I also...
I sometimes have to even change my clothes a couple times a day.
Yeah, I definitely sweat a lot more, but I actually feel healthier. I feel happier.
Do you eat more or eat differently?
I would say I never liked, prior to testosterone, I never really liked sweet things, so I wouldn't eat anything sweet, and I will occasionally eat sweet things now. I also, before I started testosterone, I ate vegetables. Like I still do, but I eat less.
Okay.
I compulsively ate spinach prior to starting to, like, I ate spinach. Like, I would buy the big bags, and I would buy like 4 a week, and I would just eat those.
Wow.
Yeah, I ate a lot.
That's actually a little excessive.
It was a lot, and I don't do that anymore. I just don't feel.
Affect your bone health, actually.
That's just the way I ate prior, and I don't do that now. I think I eat, but I don't think anything really has changed.
Okay.
I'm vegetarian, so it's not a big change. I gained a little weight, and then I lost it. So I put on a little bit of weight, and then I lost it all.
I did notice, just because our physicality is kind of the opposite, you're very interesting. Like, you're very lean, and you have, like, your veins pop out a lot. Was that something new, or has you always had that?
I've always been skinny, but I didn't have lean. Lean. Yeah. But no, the veins are new. That's definitely a testosterone.
It's cool
thing.
looking.
But I'm happy with it.
Yeah, it's cool looking.
That's definitely that sort of feels comfortable, and I do have a lot more muscle. Like, it's
yeah.
it doesn't look like it, but I actually have more than I did before.